Membria is perhaps the poorest village in Spain, but it's the most just. These words capture with rare eloquence the achievements and the promise of the anarchist revolution, promise which is yet to be fulfilled. The achievements didn't just come from nowhere. They were the outcome of many decades of struggle, of experiment, brutal repression. As I mentioned, the CNT, which is behind a lot of it, is celebrating its centenary, and that also meant learning, so knowing how to go on. This experiment of creating a world of freedom and justice was crushed all too soon by the combined forces of fascism, Stalinism, and liberal democracy. The global power centers understood very well that they must unite to destroy this dangerous threat to subordination and discipline before they turned to the secondary task of dividing up the spoils among themselves. That's what we call the Spanish Civil War. But the revolution was over before the Spanish Civil War really took off, crushed. Well, in later years, I've sometimes been able to see firsthand at least a little of the lives of poor people, like those of Membria, poor people often suffering brutal repression and violence in the miserable slums of Haiti at the peak of the terror in the early 90s, supported by Washington, though the facts are still suppressed and highly relevant to today's tragedy in Haiti, or in refugee camps in Laos, where tens of thousands of people were huddled. They were driven from their homes, recently been driven from their homes by a CIA mercenary army that swept through northern Laos. This is after years of trying to survive in caves under a relentless bombing, at that point the heaviest bombing in history, which had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, incidentally. It's one of the gravest atrocities of modern history, I think, still largely unknown, and still killing many people because the land is saturated with unexploded ordnance. Or in Palestine or southeastern Turkey and many other places. Among these, particularly important to me for personal reasons, is southern Colombia, where right now campesinos, indigenous people, Afro-Colombians, are being driven from their devastated lands by terror and from many sources, and by chemical warfare by us. Here it's called fumigation, as if we somehow have the right to destroy other countries on pretext that we manufacture. These are people capable of the most miraculous sympathy and humanity, despite the awful suffering in which we play a major part, while usually looking the other way, though in this case, at least not in Madison, thanks to the work of the Columbia Support Group here. One of the things I learned in the anarchist bookstores and offices 70 years ago was that I had been wrong in taking the fall of Barcelona in 1939 to be the death knell for freedom in Spain. It was actually 2 years earlier, in May 1937, when the industrial working class was crushed by communist-led repression, and communist armies swept through the countryside, destroying the collectives, with the assistance of the liberal democracies and with Hitler and Mussolini waiting in the wings. Well, a few years after that, I went off to graduate studies at Harvard, my first time away from home. There I had my first extensive experience with what's called the intellectual world, the elite intellectual world. Shortly after arrival, I went to the standard faculty-run party for incoming graduate students, and I was regaled by a very distinguished philosopher, I won't mention his name, with an account of the Depression. which he assured me had not taken place. It was a liberal fabrication. So there were no rag pickers coming to our door in the early 1930s trying to get some pennies to survive. And there were no women being beaten by security forces on strike outside a textile plant, which I passed by when I was maybe 5 years old on a trolley car with my mother. And there were none of my unemployed working class relatives. A few businessmen might have suffered, but beyond that, nothing happened. It was perfectly obvious from Harvard Square that was the story. Well, unfortunately, that's not an exception. Such attitudes are broader. I could mention other cases, some of them pretty ugly. But most of the people were Stevenson liberals, liberal Democrats. These are the people who applauded when Adlai Stevenson said at the United Nations that we have to defend Vietnam from what he called internal aggression, new concept that was invented. We have to defend them from the assault from within. That's what President Kennedy called it. And these are words that we hear again today. For example, last Sunday in the New York Times, where we read the following front page story. After the conquest of Marja in Helmand province, the Marines have collided with the Taliban identity so dominant that the movement appears more akin to the only political organization in a one-party town, with an influence that touches everyone. We've got to reevaluate our definition of the word enemy, said the commander of the Marine Expeditionary Brigade in Helmand province. Most people here identify themselves as Taliban. We have to readjust our thinking. So we're not trying to chase the Taliban out of Marja, we're trying to chase the enemy out. It's a subtle distinction, since the Taliban are the enemy. That's a familiar problem. It's a problem that's bedeviled conquerors from way back. It's very familiar to the United States from Vietnam, for example. Back in the mid-60s, the leading U.S. government scholar ended up being head of the Indochina archives at Berkeley. He wrote a widely praised book in which he lamented that the enemy within was, in his words, the only truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam, and any effort of ours to compete with it politically would be like a competition between a minnow and a whale. So we can't do that. We've got to find a way to overcome their political force by using our comparative advantage, which is violence, as we did successfully. Others have faced similar problems. For example, the Russians in Afghanistan in the 1980s. That was an invasion which elicited here the kind of outrage that we muster for the crimes of enemies. Middle East specialist William Polk, who was there, reminds us that the Russians, in his words, won many military victories, and through their civic action programs, they actually won over many of the villages. And in fact, as we know from reliable sources, they created substantial freedom in Kabul, particularly for women. But to go on with Polk, over the decade of their involvement, the Russians won almost every battle and occupied at one time or another virtually every inch of the country, but they lost the war. When they gave up and left, the Afghans resumed their traditional way of life. It's not exactly accurate. He's overlooking the fact that when the Russians left, the radical Islamist forces that the United States had organized with the help of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan ravaged the place. They were so devastating that the population welcomed the Taliban when they came in. And many of them are now what we call the government, the warlord government of Kabul. The dilemmas that are faced by Obama and McChrystal aren't quite the same as those faced by the Russians. The enemy, who the Marines are trying to chase out of their own villages, have virtually no outside support. The Russian invaders, in sharp contrast, were facing a resistance that received vital support from the United States, from Saudi Arabia, and from Pakistan.